Hi, my name is Ellis Orozco, and welcome to my channel, a place where we think out loud about the Bible and how its teachings have an impact on our daily lives. If that sounds interesting to you, please be sure to hit the subscribe button and check back regularly. Okay, this is the second lesson in a series of 5 lessons on how to thrive in a polytheistic culture with an aggressive agenda. Let me start by going over the big takeaways from the first lesson. In the last lesson, I had basically 2 takeaways, a thesis and an important observation. Let me remind you of the thesis. It's simply this, that like the Hebrew people in Babylon, American Christians are living in a polytheistic culture with an aggressive agenda. Add to that this observation. Christians are living in an earthly city, but are citizens of a heavenly city, what Augustine called the city of God. This means that Christians are essentially foreigners, pilgrims, just passing through this world on the way to our true home. As such, we should consider ourselves as foreigners living in a strange land. So here's the goal of this series. We want to study how the Hebrew people, as foreigners living in a strange land themselves, were able to not only survive, but thrive in that foreign culture, which, as it turns out, was a polytheistic culture with an aggressive agenda. So in today's lesson, I want to give an overview of that Babylonian culture. I want us to get to know it. And here's how we're going to tackle that. First, I'm going to give you a thumbnail sketch of the history of Babylon and the nature of the Babylonian culture. Second, I'm going to glean 4 important ways that the Babylonian culture impacted the Hebrew people in general and Judaism in particular. And then finally, I want to suggest 5 core characteristics of that polytheistic culture with an aggressive agenda and what it means for us as Christians. Okay, so the Babylonian Empire. Let's start there. The Babylonian Empire was one of the most powerful and influential empires in the ancient world. It's located in Mesopotamia between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. The Babylonian Empire was a hub of trade, commerce, and culture that flourished for centuries. Its capital city, Babylon, was a marvel of engineering and architecture. This, by the way, is the area of the world where Abraham was born and lived the first half of his life. Now, the history of the Babylonian Empire dates back to about 2000 BC. About the time that Abraham was actually leaving that area of the world to follow God's call. At that time, Babylon was a small city-state, but over time it grew in size and power. And then in 1792, King Hammurabi became king of Babylon. Hammurabi united much of Mesopotamia under his rule and established what is known as the Babylonian Empire. Hammurabi is famous for his law code, which was one of the earliest and most comprehensive legal systems in the world. His law code is a testament to the Babylonian Empire's sophisticated society where justice and fairness were highly valued. So under the strong leadership of Hammurabi and the sophisticated legal system that valued justice and fairness, the Babylonian Empire began to flourish. Babylon became a hub of trade and commerce. It was located on the major trade routes between East and West, and its merchants became renowned for their wealth and their skill. The Babylonians were also skilled farmers and engineers, and they developed sophisticated irrigation systems that allowed them to cultivate the crops in that particularly arid part of the world. The Babylonians were also skilled astronomers and mathematicians. They developed a sophisticated system of mathematics that included the use of fractions and decimal notations. They also made significant contributions to astronomy that included the development of the zodiac, which is still used today. Now, after the death of Hammurabi, the Babylonian Empire began a slow but steady decline until 626 BC and the rise of 2 kings who ushered in a revival of culture and power for Babylon. King Nabopolassar, who took the throne in 626 BC, and King Nebuchadnezzar II, who took the throne after him in 605 BC and ruled for 43 years. Together, they ushered in what has become known as the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Now, that's important because that's the Babylonian Empire that the Bible deals with. So, under King Nebuchadnezzar II, the empire reached the height of its power and prosperity. Nebuchadnezzar was a great builder and undertook major construction projects, including the famous Hanging Gardens of Babylon, which was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. He also expanded Babylon's fortifications and built impressive palaces and temples. Nebuchadnezzar II was also a patron of the arts and sciences. He encouraged the study of astronomy and mathematics, and Babylonian astronomers made significant contributions to the development of that field. He also sponsored the creation of the Babylonian Chronicles, a series of historical texts that that recorded the events of his reign and that of his predecessors. Despite its many contributions, the Neo-Babylonian Empire was not without its conflicts and wars. The empire was constantly threatened by the Assyrians in the north and the Egyptians in the west, and Nebuchadnezzar II engaged in several military campaigns to protect its borders. One of the most significant conflicts was the Babylonian siege of Jerusalem in 587 BC, which resulted in the destruction of the city of Jerusalem and the temple that Solomon had built. It also resulted in the exile of many Jews to Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar needed Jerusalem and that entire land as a buffer between Babylon and Egypt. His ability to conquer that land led to a period of unprecedented growth in power and influence. Now, let's talk a bit about the religion of Babylon. From the beginning, the Babylonians were a deeply religious people with a complex and multifaceted religious system that incorporated many different gods and goddesses into their daily life. The religion of the Babylonians was an integral part of their culture, and the various beliefs and practices of the Babylonians shaped every aspect of their lives. The Babylonians believed in a pantheon of gods and goddesses, each of whom had their own specific domain and sphere of influence. Among the most prominent of these gods were Marduk, the patron god of Babylon, Nabu, the god of writing and knowledge, and Ishtar, the goddess of love and fertility. The Babylonians believed that these gods and goddesses were responsible for every aspect of their lives, from their fertility of their crops to the success of their military campaigns. One of the most important religious practices of the Babylonians was the construction of temples and shrines dedicated to their gods and goddesses. These temples were often grand structures, decorated with intricate carvings and adorned with precious materials, metals, and gemstones. They were the center of religious life in Babylon and were staffed by priests and priestesses who performed daily rituals and ceremonies to honor their gods. Another important aspect of Babylonian religious life was the practice of divination, which involved interpreting the will of the gods through various signs and omens. The Babylonians believed that the gods communicated with them through the natural world, and that by observing the movements of the stars and the planets, the light, the flight of birds, and the behavior of animals, they could gain insight into the will of the gods. Astrology in particular was an important part of divination, and the Babylonians were skilled astronomers who were able to predict eclipses and other astronomical events with remarkable accuracy. Sacrifice was also an important part of the Babylonian religious life. The Babylonians believed that by offering food, drink, and animals to the gods, they would appease them and gain their favor. Animal sacrifices were particularly common, and many of the temples in Babylon had dedicated areas for slaughtering and preparing animals for sacrifice. Now, with the rise of Nebuchadnezzar II and the Neo-Babylonian Empire came a shift in the religious life of Babylon. It began to move very slowly from the traditional religious practices to the religion known as Zoroastrianism. This is important because this is about the time that the Hebrew people were exiled into Babylon. This is when the Hebrew people came into the picture of Babylonian history. Zoroastrianism is actually considered a monotheistic religion that worships Ahura Mazda, the god of wisdom, and promotes the values of truth, righteousness, and good deeds. The religion was founded by Zoroaster, a prophet who lived in the 6th century BC. During this period, Babylon was the cultural and economic center of the region, and the empire was known for its tolerance towards different religions and cultures. Religious tolerance is a characteristic of a polytheistic society. This religious tolerance allowed the rise of Zoroastrianism in the region. And as a side note, not unlike the polytheism of Rome and the religious tolerance of Rome allowed for the rise of Christianity. So let's talk a little bit now about the impact of the Babylonian culture on the Hebrew people. The Babylonian Empire was a significant impact on the Hebrew people and the development of Judaism. This influence was felt both before, during, and after the Babylonian exile, which began in 586 BC when King Nebuchadnezzar II conquered the kingdom of Judah and destroyed Solomon's temple in Jerusalem. Prior to the Babylonian exile, the Hebrew people had already scattered to some degree. You had Hebrew people living in Egypt and Arabia, Asia Minor, and Mesopotamia, which was Babylon. The Hebrew people living in Palestine were also impacted by the Babylonians through communication with their family and friends who were living there already, through diplomatic relationships, and of course through commercial trade. This exposure had its significant impact on Hebrew culture, including their religious practices. One of the most significant Babylonian religious practices to influence the Hebrews was astrology. The Babylonians were known for their complex astrological systems, which were based on the movements of the stars and planets. The Hebrew people began to incorporate some of these practices into their own religious beliefs, including the belief in angels, a more robust theology of the afterlife, and the use of astrology to predict future events. Think about the birth narratives in the Gospel of Matthew that has the Magi coming from the east, from Babylon, following a star, right, that predicted the birth of the Messiah. So after the Babylonian exile, the influence of Babylon on the Hebrew people and on Judaism became even more pronounced. During their exile, the Hebrews were exposed to the Babylonian culture in a much more direct way. They were forced to live among the Babylonians and adopt their customs, including the language and the religion. Now, you have to understand something, that it was the Hebrew people living in exile in Babylon who preserved the Jewish faith, who preserved Judaism. There were Jews living everywhere, as I mentioned, in Egypt, in Arabia, and Asia Minor. There were Jews living in Jerusalem. You would expect that they would have been the ones that preserved the faith, but no. Judaism disappeared in those areas, and it was the Babylonian exiles who preserved Judaism and really, to some degree, saved Judaism. And this is why Babylon had such a powerful impact on Judaism. One of the most significant Babylonian influences on Judaism after the exile was the development of the Talmud. The Talmud is a collection of Jewish laws and teachings that was compiled in Babylon during the 3rd and 5th centuries AD. Now, the Babylonian Talmud became the primary source of Jewish law and tradition, and its influence can still be felt in Jewish communities to this very day, and it was compiled in Babylon. Another important Babylonian influence on Judaism was the development of the synagogue, which happened during the exile. Prior to the Babylonian exile, the Hebrews worshipped in the temple in Jerusalem. But after the temple was destroyed, the Hebrews were forced to develop a new way to worship. The Babylonians already had a tradition of gathering in community centers called ziggurats, and the Hebrew people adopted that practice, developing the synagogue as a place of worship and community. That happened in Babylon. In addition to these cultural and religious influences, the Babylonian exile also had a profound impact on the Hebrews' sense of identity and their relationship with God. The exile was a traumatic experience, and it forced the Hebrews to confront difficult questions about their faith, about their God, and about their relationship with God. This experience ultimately led to the development of a deeper and more complex understanding of God and the role of the Hebrew people in the larger world. The attitude towards Babylon of those living through the exile was mixed. There was certainly a degree of negativity because they had been brutally conquered by the Babylonians. But there was also a certain degree of respect toward Babylon, especially for those who had to live there and later those who were born there. The Hebrew leaders and prophets saw the Babylonians as instruments in the hands of God to punish the Hebrew people and to teach them a lesson. 1 Chronicles 9:1, for instance, says this: All Israel was listed in the genealogies recorded in the book of the kings of Israel and Judah. They were taken captive to Babylon because of their unfaithfulness. And Ezra 5:12 says this: But because our ancestors angered the God of heaven, he gave them into the hands of Nebuchadnezzar the Chaldean, king of Babylon, who destroyed this temple and deported the people to Babylon. They knew that God would eventually free them and punish Babylon. Isaiah chapter 13, verse 19 says this: Babylon, the jewel of kingdoms, the pride and glory of the Babylonians, will be overthrown by God like Sodom and Gomorrah. And Jeremiah 51:4 says this: Before your eyes I will repay Babylon and all who live in Babylon for all the wrong they have done in Zion, declares the Lord. But they also saw how the Babylonians treated them relatively well, even in exile. Jeremiah, for instance, was given his freedom. The king of Babylon, speaking to Jeremiah, says this in Jeremiah chapter 40, verse 4. But today I am freeing you from the chains of your wrists. Come with me to Babylon if you like, and I will look after you. But if you do not want to, then don't come. Look, the whole country lies before you. Go wherever you please. And King Jehoiakim was eventually freed from prison and treated with respect in Babylon. The king released him from prison, and the Bible writes this, 2 Kings chapter 25, verses 27 to 30. So Jehoiakim put aside his prison clothes, and for the rest of his life ate regularly at the king's table. Day by day, the king gave Jehoiakim a regular allowance as long as he lived. And the word of the Lord to the Hebrew exiles was to submit to the Babylonian authorities because they too were created by God, and they too were instruments in the hands of God. And they, the Babylonians, were going to be used by God to teach the Hebrew people some important lessons. This is what Jeremiah says in Jeremiah 27, verses 4 through 12. He says, "Give them a message for their masters and say, 'This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says. Tell this to your masters. With my great power and outstretched arm, I made the earth and its people and the animals that are in it, and I give it to anyone I please. Now I will give all your countries into the hands of my servant Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. I will make even the wild animals subject to him. But if any nation will bow its neck under the yoke of the king of Babylon and serve him, I will let that nation remain in its own land and till it and live there, declares the Lord.' I gave the same message to Zedekiah, king of Judah. I said, 'Bow your neck under the yoke of the king of Babylon, serve him and his people, and you will live.'" Okay, so the Babylonian culture was going to be used by God to teach the Hebrew people certain lessons. More importantly, it was going to be an incubator that was going to protect, solidify, and preserve the Hebrew faith. That's a big deal. That's a very big deal. That God can use a polytheistic culture with an aggressive agenda to strengthen and forge your faith. So, what are the characteristics of this polytheistic culture that impacts us? Let me just give you 5 characteristics of the polytheistic culture that impact your Christian life. Number 1, a polytheistic culture produces many different religious ideas. Some are interesting, some provocative, some profound, some wacko and crazy. But here's how it impacts you. It will force you to think deeply about what you believe. In a polytheistic culture, you'd better know not only what you believe, but why you believe it. That's a good thing. Number 2, a polytheistic culture threatens any monotheistic belief system. Monotheism basically says there is only one God, and here he is. This is his name. Monotheism is inherently exclusive. And what that means for you is that it will demand that from time to time you take a stand. It will demand that you be courageous from time to time. And number 3 is that a polytheistic culture is an open source system where all voices have a platform. And with that many voices coming at you all the time, what it means is that it will teach you to listen with a discerning ear. As a Christian in a polytheistic culture with an aggressive agenda, you must develop a discerning ear for everything that you're hearing. And number 4, a polytheistic culture rewards tolerance. In fact, most often the polytheistic culture will elevate tolerance to its premier virtue. Now, there's nothing wrong with tolerance. Tolerance is important. It's a great tool. The problem is tolerance is not a virtue. I'll talk more about that later. But for now, let me just say that what this does is that it will teach you to appreciate those who disagree with you. In a polytheistic culture with an aggressive agenda, you must learn to appreciate those who disagree with you. You must practice the words of Jesus where he says, love your enemies and pray for them. And number 5, a polytheistic culture is deeply religious. Deeply religious. It has built into it the language of religion with faith stories and myths, rituals and ceremonies that define most religions. And what this does is that it will give you unlimited opportunities and a common language to talk about your religion, to talk about your faith. So these are the 5 primary characteristics of a polytheistic culture and how they impact you. So next week, we're going to begin to look at the biblical characters of the Babylonian exile. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, Esther, Nehemiah, Mordecai, and others. And we're going to begin to look at the strategies they used, not only to survive, but to actually flourish while living in a polytheistic culture with an aggressive agenda. So we're going to start to look at those, and we're going to point out the things they did. That's next week. I hope this has been a blessing to you. I hope you've learned something from it, and I hope you continue with me through this series. I think it's going to be very fruitful for you if you do. Please don't forget to hit the subscribe button. Let me know that you're here in the comment section, and keep coming back each week. God bless you, and I can't wait to see you next week.